3 days after leaving the hospital, Camille still had to brace herself against the counter whenever she reached for something above the stove. Her right side had healed faster than the surgeons expected, but the left still pulled with every stretch, a deep interior ache that no one who hadn't been through it could quite understand. She made the pasta anyway, Spencer's favorite, the one with the slow-cooked tomato sauce she'd been making since their first winter together in that apartment on 17th Avenue. She set the table while the sauce simmered, 2 plates, 2 glasses of water, because Spencer had cut back on wine since the transplant. He came through the front door at 7:15 without calling ahead. She heard the sound of his dress shoes on the hardwood, then nothing. No greeting, no door closing behind him with the familiar quiet thud she'd spent 3 years listening for. When she turned around, he was already halfway through the living room, scrolling his phone. Spencer. He looked up briefly, the way you glance at a passing car. Then his eyes dropped back to the screen. I didn't know you were cooking. I told you this morning. He said nothing to that. His phone buzzed in his hand, and he turned toward the hallway that led to the bedroom they no longer shared. Camille held the counter with both hands. I'm not supposed to be alone yet, the doctor said. Your parents are 10 minutes away. You're my husband. Spencer paused at the edge of the hallway. He looked at her then, not at her face, but somewhere near her shoulder, the way he'd been looking at her for months, slightly past her, as if something more important was always just out of frame. I have an early flight, he said. I'll be back by Friday. His phone buzzed again. He was already walking before she could answer. Camille stood between the stove and the table she'd set for 2, and for the first time since the surgery, she let herself think the thing she'd been pushing away since October, that she had given a piece of her body to this man, and he could no longer be bothered to come home for dinner. 3 years before any of that, Camille had a life that felt exactly like something she'd worked for and actually gotten. She was 30 and living in Calgary, running a caseload of post-surgical and sports rehabilitation patients at Ridgeline Physiotherapy in Brentwood. She was good at her job in the particular way that isn't loud about itself. Patients asked for her by name, stayed their full course of treatment, and sometimes sent notes months after discharge to say they'd run a 10K or carried their grandchild up the stairs without pain. She had earned that competence through 5 years of schooling and another 3 of clinical hours, and she didn't take it lightly. Spencer had come into her life through a mutual friend at a housewarming in Kensington. He owned a small but growing real estate development firm, the kind building infill housing across Calgary's inner neighborhoods at a time when the market had just started to recover. He was confident in a way that wasn't arrogant. He listened when other people spoke, asked follow-up questions, and never dominated a room so much as he settled into it. Camille liked that about him. She was cautious with new people, and he gave her room to be. They dated for a year and a half before moving in together. They married in a small outdoor ceremony at a ranch outside Cochrane, just family and close friends, Grace and Paul standing with Camille while the mountains held everything in place behind them. Monique, her closest friend from undergrad, and now her colleague at Ridgeline, stood beside her. The first 2 years were ordinary in the best sense. They argued about money and household decisions and what to do about his mother, the way couples do. They had plans, not extravagant ones but real ones, a home with more space eventually, and children when the timing felt less uncertain. Camille was not a woman who needed everything at once. She trusted the slow accumulation of a life built with someone she chose on purpose. Then Spencer started losing weight. It happened over a winter, gradually enough that neither of them named it at first. He was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. His ankles swelled. He had headaches that came and went without clear cause. By February, his family doctor had referred him to a specialist, and by March the diagnosis was confirmed. Chronic kidney disease progressed to stage 4. His kidneys were failing. The conversations that followed were the hardest of their marriage. Spencer's team explained dialysis, transplant wait lists, the variables involved. He was young enough and otherwise healthy enough to be a good transplant candidate, but the wait list in Alberta was long. Dialysis would preserve his function for a time, but it would mean 3 sessions per week, hours each visit, fatigue that would deepen over time. Camille asked when she could be tested as a living donor. Spencer told her she didn't have to do that. She said she knew she didn't have to. She was tested. The results came back 3 weeks later. She was a match. The decision did not feel heroic to Camille. It felt like the most obvious thing available to her. Spencer was 34 years old and healthy except for his kidneys. She had two. If she could give one and he could live his life without dialysis, without the slow deterioration of a transplant list that might take years, then she was going to give one. That was the whole calculation. The surgery was scheduled for June. Camille prepared her caseload, briefed her patients, and arranged coverage with Monique. Grace cried when Camille told her on a Sunday phone call. Paul did not cry, but he drove down from Red Deer that same evening and stayed for dinner without being asked, which meant more. Both surgeries went smoothly. Spencer's recovery was monitored carefully over the following months. His new kidney functioned well. His color returned, his energy improved, and by autumn his nephrologist was using words like excellent outcome. Camille's recovery was slower, as expected. Her surgical site healed without complications, but the fatigue lasted longer than the brochures suggested. She needed restrictions on physical activity for weeks, then months at reduced capacity. She rested when she had to, attended her follow-up appointments, and adjusted without complaint. Spencer had been present through the surgery and the early weeks at home. He brought her tea. He drove her to appointments. He sat beside her on the couch while she read and asked how she was feeling before she had to volunteer it. Camille did not think of what she'd given him as something requiring repayment, but his care during those weeks felt like proof that the marriage she believed in was still intact. She did not yet understand how short that window would be. The changes came quietly, the way they always do when someone is trying not to be caught making them. By August, Spencer had returned to work full-time. His company had a development in the Beltline and another proposal out for a site in East Village. The recovery that had paused his business life was over, and he stepped back into it with the kind of energy his illness had temporarily suspended. Camille understood that. She would have felt the same returning to Ridgeline. But the evenings began to shift. Spencer worked later. When he came home, he was present in the physical sense, eating, watching something on television, but his attention had the quality of someone who was already somewhere else. He started carrying his phone differently, face down on every surface, angled away when it buzzed. When it rang in the evenings, he moved into the study to answer. Camille told herself it was the stress of catching up. His business had been on hold for months while he was ill and while she recovered. Of course, there was pressure. She told herself that for longer than she should have. The guest room came next. Spencer mentioned it first as a practical thing. Her sleep was still disrupted from recovery. His early starts were disturbing her. They'd both sleep better with space. There was logic in it, and Camille agreed. She expected it to be temporary. A week became a month. The door to the guest room was closed more nights than not. She had a follow-up appointment in September that she'd reminded him about twice. He had said he would try to make it. He was not there when Grace drove her to the Foothills Medical Center that morning. Camille sat through the appointment and listened to her nephrologist explain the numbers, and afterward she sat in Grace's car in the parking structure for a few minutes without speaking. He had a client meeting, she said finally. Grace didn't say anything. She started the car. Monique saw it more clearly because she was outside it. She visited the house on weekends and noticed the closed door at the end of the hall. She noticed that Spencer's shoes weren't by the door when she arrived on Saturday afternoons. "Where is he?" she asked once. "Vancouver, site visit." Again. Camille straightened the cushions on the couch. The East Village project involves a lot of coordination with the Vancouver investors. He's been back and forth. Monique looked at her. She didn't press it that day, but she came back. Spencer's company had hired an interior design firm for the Beltline project. Jade was 26 and had joined that firm earlier in the year, fresh from her master's program in Vancouver. She was talented. Camille would learn that later, from interviews and profiles she did not go looking for but eventually found. Spencer met her at a project meeting in September. By the time Camille was sitting alone in the Foothills parking structure, Spencer and Jade had exchanged 6 weeks of messages that had nothing to do with the Beltline project. Jade did not know he was married. Spencer had not told her. He wore his wedding ring at the office and removed it at client dinners and site visits. When she asked him once, at a restaurant in Gastown where no one knew them, whether he was seeing anyone, he told her he'd gone through a separation earlier in the year, that the marriage had been struggling before his illness, that he and his wife had been living apart more or less for months. Every part of that was designed to sound true. The trips to Vancouver multiplied through autumn. A week in October, 4 days in November, Spencer explained each one with project details Camille had no way to verify. She was not naive. She was choosing alternative required her to accept that the man she'd given a kidney to was doing exactly what she increasingly suspected he was doing. She found out the way people often do now, not through a confrontation or a confession but through a photograph. Spencer, at a firm holiday party in early December, posted on a public account. He was standing beside a woman Camille didn't recognize, both of them angled toward each other in the way people do when the space between them is already smaller than it looks. His left hand was at his side. No ring. Camille put her phone down on the kitchen table. She picked it up again and looked at the photograph a second time. Then she called Monique, who arrived within the hour. They sat at the kitchen table together, and Monique did not say she'd known, or that she'd suspected, even though both things were true. She said, "What do you want to do?" Camille didn't answer that night. She waited until Spencer came home 2 days later. She left the photograph open on her phone and placed it on the counter where he would see it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he sat down. The conversation lasted 2 hours and resolved nothing. Spencer admitted he had been talking to someone. He used words like connection and didn't plan for this, and the last year has been so hard. He did not mention that he'd told Jade he was separated. He said the marriage had changed since the surgery, that Camille had changed, that he didn't know how to explain it except that he'd felt alone. Camille sat across the table from the man whose life she had extended with her own body and listened to him explain that she had made him feel alone. She asked him to leave the house that night. He went without much argument. She understood that the lack of argument was its own answer. Grace and Paul arrived the next morning. Camille did not break down when they walked in. She showed them to the kitchen, made coffee, and explained what she knew. Grace took her hand. Paul sat with his elbows on the table and looked out the window. "We'll figure it out," Paul said, "step by step." Camille called a family lawyer that week, not because she expected a battle, but because Monique had told her plainly that she needed someone in her corner before any paperwork started. The lawyer's name was Adina. She reviewed the marriage's assets calmly and told Camille exactly what she was entitled to, including a specific provision for ongoing medical follow-up costs related to the donation. That last part mattered. Camille's nephrologist had explained that living donors required monitoring for the remainder of their lives, annual blood panels, medication reviews, appointments that added up. In a country where some of those costs fell outside provincial coverage, the numbers were real. Adina made sure the settlement included a designated sum for exactly that purpose. Spencer tried once to negotiate the clause out. His lawyer called it speculative. Adina held firm. The clause stayed. Camille had given Spencer a kidney. She was not going to spend the rest of her life paying out of pocket for the consequences. The divorce was finalized in February. Spencer received less than he'd expected. Camille received the settlement, the medical provision, and the investment account she had maintained separately before the marriage. She gave back nothing that was rightfully hers. She moved into an apartment in Inglewood, close enough to Ridgeline to walk on clear days. Grace helped her unpack on a Saturday morning. Monique brought food. Paul assembled the bed frame and refused to let Camille hand him anything she was still being cautious about lifting. It was not the life she had planned. It was a life she could actually build. 2 weeks after the divorce became final, Spencer posted a photograph with Jade on his personal account. A restaurant in Kensington, a place Camille and Spencer had eaten at for their second anniversary. Jade had her hand near his on the table. He was smiling in the way he used to smile when things were easy. Camille looked at the photograph for 30 seconds, then put her phone away. She had already counted backward through the timeline, the dates of the Vancouver trips. The first closed door. The September appointment she attended alone. Spencer had not found Jade after the marriage fell apart. He had used Jade to decide it was already over. Camille understood now that she had spent months making excuses for a man who was already somewhere else. She did not contact Jade. She did not post anything public. She had a follow-up appointment on Thursday and a full caseload at Ridgeline starting Monday, and those things required her attention in a way Spencer's choices no longer did. Camille returned to her full hours at Ridgeline by spring. She had worried that the tiredness she still couldn't quite hide, the careful way she moved through a long clinic day, would make patients hesitant or overly gentle with her. Most of them simply needed her to listen and to help them move without pain. She could still do both. Monique stayed close. She shared a lunch break every Thursday, covered the administrative tasks Camille found hardest on difficult days, and did not pretend there were no difficult days. Camille also began attending a support group at the Foothills Donor Network, a monthly meeting for living organ donors, navigating the medical and emotional aftermath of donation. She had been referred to it at her one-year follow-up. She went once out of obligation and returned because something in the room felt necessary. The facilitator was a social worker named Brennan. He had been running the group for 3 years and had the particular skill of asking one question that opened up something people hadn't expected to say. He was not a flashy person. He brought tea bags and set them out on a folding table before each session and never called attention to it. Camille noticed that he remembered specific details people had mentioned the previous month. Not file notes, but the actual things they'd said, the fears they'd named out loud. She did not think of him in personal terms for a long time. He was the facilitator. She was working through something. The line was clear and she preferred it that way. In September, a year after the surgery, Camille was asked to speak at a fundraising event for the Kidney Foundation of Canada. The organizer had heard about her through her nephrologist and wanted a patient story for the evening program. Camille agreed on one condition: she could speak plainly. She was not going to perform resilience for a room full of donors if it meant leaving out the harder parts. She spoke for 12 minutes. She talked about the surgery, the recovery, the fatigue that lasted longer than the brochures suggested. And then she talked about the year that followed, about learning that sacrifice did not guarantee the response you expected from the people you'd made it for. She did not name Spencer. She did not need to. A woman who had donated to her brother 4 years earlier took Camille's hand afterward and said, "No one ever talks about what happens after." Camille told her, "I know. That's why I did." Spencer saw a clip of the speech online. He called Camille that evening for the first time in 8 months. She did not answer. He called again the next morning. "I saw the clip," he said. "Okay. Were you talking about me?" Camille looked out the window of her Inglewood apartment. "I was talking about what happened to me." Spencer said he wanted to apologize in person. That he'd handled everything wrong. That he'd been scared after the illness and made decisions he regretted. He thought she deserved to hear it from him face to face. Camille was quiet for a moment. "If you need to say that to feel better about yourself, find a therapist. I'm not available for that." She ended the call. What she did not know was that Jade had seen the same clip. Jade, who had moved to Calgary and been with Spencer for nearly a year. Jade, who had been told that Camille was an ex-wife who had withdrawn from the marriage during a difficult time. The clip showed a woman who had clearly not withdrawn from anything. Jade went back through the dates Camille had referenced in the speech: the surgery, the recovery period, the year of follow-up appointments, and compared them against what Spencer had told her when they first started talking. He had said he was already separated before his transplant, that the marriage had been over in every meaningful way long before Jade. The speech made clear that Camille had still been Spencer's wife, still recovering from the surgery she had undergone for him. During every month Spencer spent telling Jade otherwise. Jade ended the relationship that same week. Spencer's professional reputation followed a quieter but more persistent arc. Calgary's development and design community was not large, and the story of what had happened, the transplant, the timeline, what Spencer had done during his wife's recovery, moved through it the way these things do. Not loudly but steadily. A firm that had been considering him for a joint proposal passed without explanation. A client meeting that had been pending went cold. Spencer cut expenses, canceled projects, and reduced the company's size as work redirected itself to people whose names didn't carry the weight of that particular story. He came to Ridgeline one Friday afternoon in November. Monique intercepted him in the waiting area. He said he wanted to speak with Camille. Monique said she could leave a message. He waited 20 minutes, then left when it became clear Camille was not coming out. She was told afterward. She felt neither upset nor relieved. She had prepared for that visit the way she had prepared for the surgery and the follow-up appointments, and the first morning she walked back into Ridgeline after everything, by deciding what she owed herself and holding to it. She owed herself a life that didn't wait for Spencer to decide she was worth returning to. Brennan had been at the Kidney Foundation event. He had attended as a supporter, not as Camille's facilitator, and they had spoken briefly at the end of the evening. He told her it was exactly what people needed to hear. They talked for 10 minutes about the donor network and the gap in long-term psychological support for people post-donation, and then the room was winding down and they said goodnight. He came to the next support group session with the same quiet preparation as always. Tea bags on the folding table, notebook open. He asked Camille afterward, in the corridor outside the meeting room, whether she'd be willing to join a planning committee for a new peer support program he was developing with the Foothills team. She said yes. They met twice a month through the winter. The conversation usually started with the program, and gradually lasted longer than it needed to. Brennan did not blur the professional line while one existed. He did not use his role in Camille's recovery to position himself as something more. When the peer support program launched in February, and Camille transitioned from participant to co-facilitator, the dynamic between them shifted cleanly into something neither of them had arranged, but both had recognized. He asked if she would have dinner with him in March. Not as colleagues, he said clearly. She said yes. What developed between them did so without rush. Brennan had a patience that was not passive. He showed up consistently, in specific ways, and never asked Camille to perform her recovery for his benefit. When she talked about the marriage and the surgery and the year that followed, he listened without turning it into something he could fix. He did not pretend the weight of that time was invisible, and he did not treat it as something she needed to move past before she deserved something good. He had known her at her most uncertain. He had watched her speak at Foothills, halting at first and then steadier, about things she had never expected to say out loud. He had watched her become the person who helped others find language for what they were carrying. He knew that version of Camille, the one assembled after the year she wouldn't have chosen, and it was exactly the version he had stayed for. Camille understood slowly and then all at once that this was the kind of knowing she had always wanted. Not someone attracted to the life she presented before the difficulty arrived, but someone who had walked in during the difficulty and remained because she was worth remaining for. They married on a warm Saturday in July, outside in the foothills west of Calgary, where the light goes long and gold in the late afternoon. Grace stood with her arm through Paul's. Monique laughed through most of the ceremony, which Camille had predicted. Brennan's sister read something short and true. The mountains were there the way they always are. Steady, unhurried, making everything else feel correctly sized. A year and a half after the wedding, Camille and Brennan welcomed a daughter. Camille took leave from Ridgeline and returned to the peer support program 2 afternoons a week, carrying her daughter through the same corridor where she had once been the one needing support. Brennan brought tea. Their daughter watched the overhead lights with great seriousness, the way new people study a world they haven't yet decided how to feel about. Camille had once believed a good marriage meant finding someone who would stand beside her through anything. She had not been wrong about what marriage could be. She had been wrong about the man she'd chosen to share it with. Spencer had loved the version of Camille that made his life easier. When making his life easier cost Camille something permanent, he looked for a replacement instead of staying to witness what she would make of the cost. Brennan had never required her to be easier. He had only ever asked her to be honest, and met her honesty with his own. Camille had given a piece of herself to save a life that turned out not to belong to the marriage she thought she was protecting. What she built in the space that loss created was the life she had actually been working toward the whole time. Donating that kidney did not decide who Camille was. It only made clearer who she had always been. If Camille's story moved you, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to Julia's Story for more real, emotional stories about women who find their way back to themselves. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.